Hey guys, welcome back. We're coming at you today with another commentary for the Summer of Arcade 2023 special, and today we are going to be covering Metal Slug X. Metal Slug X, due to contrary belief, is not really a new game. It is a rehash of 2 with various things that they did with the other Metal Slug titles, weapon balances, various fixes, a slight increase to performance, and then a color palette swap in some areas. So it's really not per se a whole new game. You know, they just kind of tweaked and tuned and changed a couple of things and tried to clean up performance wherever they could. So the commentary, if I can speak straight, today is going to focus, I think, a little bit more around emulation and stuff. And so it's kind of just one of those weird things. I wanted to touch down on it because I feel that there's like a lot of misconceptions about emulation that really just kind of go unaddressed. And it's really just kind of an oddball thing. So me, I love emulation. I love playing those old games and stuff. I love preserving games as well because I want the future generations to be able to enjoy these classics. Now, not all these older games are bangers. That's fine. You know, I still want kids to be able to go and enjoy and experience the horror for themselves. If we gotta go and live through this shit, so do they. But a lot of people, I feel like, when they get started in emulation, one of the biggest misconceptions is, I'm gonna get my emulator, I'm gonna download all these ROMs from the internet, or I'll make backups, whatever the hell. A lot of people just go and download their ROMs and stuff. And I'm going to plug that ROM in, and no matter what emulator I use, the experience is always going to be perfect. So I will be going over the method for that today, essentially, and explaining a couple of core truths that people probably aren't going to like, but I feel that they need to hear it. So emulation's been around for a while. It's a hell of a lot better than what it used to be. You know, like we used to have emulators. Their big claim to fame back in the 90s was they were able to run Mario at like 20 frames consistently, and that was a huge thing back then. So you go and you fast forward to today, emulators are no longer catering to just a single console. There's just so many of them. You got emulators for DOS, you got emulators for SNES, Sega, PlayStation, PlayStation 2. You know, there's even a PS3 emulator out there. There's an OG Xbox emulator. You know, all of those older consoles, they were just regulated to Japan only. We have emulators for those. And this is an amazing thing because it allows you to go get foreign games without having to go spend $500 on a console, you know, that's not only vintage, but it's from another country that you would have to tailor to work over here. And you can go and you can try to enjoy the game and stuff. And so that's really great. I love emulation in that regard. The problem that I have is everybody seems to think that everything's going to run perfect right out of the box. So the truth of the matter is that no, it doesn't. Some consoles are really, really hard to emulate, and a lot of people don't really realize that. Most of Nintendo's newer stuff is a chronic raging pain in the ass. Like SNES was easy, NES is easy. I find that N64 is notoriously hard to emulate, and that's because nobody really understood how the N64 worked. So a lot of the time when you would go and play an N64 game and you were trying to create an emulator around it, you would have to kind of guess what would work because it didn't have open architecture. So it was really just one of those things. I mean, N64 emulation is actually really good now, especially with like Mupen 64 Plus. And a lot of people don't realize that in order to get some platforms to work, you have to play with them. Not every renderer is going to work correctly. Not every resolution is going to work correctly. You can have the beefiest computer known to man, and it's not always going to work correctly. There is no one-size-fits-all solutions. Now, there are some emulators out there that are pretty goddamn good, and you don't have to play around with them too much. PPSSPP is one of them. OpenEMU does a pretty good job if you're on Mac. Doing that all the way up until, I want to say, Saturn? Yeah, Saturn is pretty much where that effectively ends. You know, so it does a pretty good job at being plug and play. Like, some emulators are actually really, really good. And then some, like other emulators, people will go and plug a game into them, and they'll assume that the emulator is really, really bad. But the thing is the emulator could be fine, it's just the system itself is hard to emulate. N64 was hard, Sega Saturn was hard. Dreamcast, even though it was a bit open, was kind of difficult at times. GameCube is kind of difficult to emulate on certain platforms as well, and you have to go and like tweak and tune your games to get them to function right. So this is kind of like when you go and you start doing emulation, this is kind of what you're signing up for a little bit. Some emulators are better at it than others. I know that PlayStation emulation is really easy. PS2 emulation has gotten a lot better in recent years. PS3 emulation is still kind of a burgeoning thing. It's not perfect, but it's getting there. GameCube is hard to do. N64 is smoothed it out a lot. Like, there are platforms that run better than others. Dreamcast is, well, it was hard to emulate. Now it's really easy, now that people have things figured out. You know, and then Sega Saturn is notoriously difficult as well because of all the coprocessors it had and how squirrely the hardware was. And so I think as somebody that dabbles around in emulation a bit, like I'm no master of it by any means, but I do enjoy the learning experience that I get from it. I think I get kind of annoyed with it when people go and they'll like want to play the game and they'll get mad because it doesn't work immediately. Like, it's really weird because people will want to play the game, which is fine, but at the same time they will not go and tweak it and tune it to make it run properly. They just kind of expect a seamless plug and play experience. And then there's other things to take into consideration as well. Like, I know that emulation on PC is a lot better. You can do way more with it. Most of the emulation that I've done in recent years is literally on Mac and Android. Android is more of a recent thing. I feel that the Android community catches a lot of shit because a lot of those that play, emulators on Android and stuff, they're kind of plagiarized as being unappreciative of whatever labor that the person who programmed the emulator has done. But to be fair, I see the same shit on PC too, so, you know, they're not innocent in that regard. I see a lot of people sit there and say, oh, well, everybody on Android's used to getting things for free. A lot of them don't even realize that a lot of the apps we use are paid. Whereas emulators on PC, you can just go and get it, you know. And so it's just kind of weird, you know. Emulating all these games, all of this was done on Android using a combination of Yabasan Shiro, Lupin 64, Redream is really good for Dreamcast and stuff. And of course, you know, we had RetroArch with various cores, you know, like, it takes a lot to get these games running. And then some emulators don't play well with the hardware that you're using. I know Yabasen Shiro, as soon as I swapped up, Yabasen Shiro does not really want to go and run anything correctly anymore. Which is oddball because the Yabasen Shiro core in RetroArch goes and runs amazingly well. And so you'll find that as you go and you import this library of games that you're going and trying to play and stuff, you'll find that not every app is going to run every game flawlessly. So when I went ahead and installed the front end for my handheld, I found that some emulators just didn't like it, Yabasen Shiro being one of them. So I would have to go and tweak and tune the front end as well, you know, and I would have to be like, okay, obviously this doesn't work. We need to tweak it and tune it and redirect it so it uses RetroArch instead of Yabasen Shiro. And for the stuff that doesn't really want to go and work in RetroArch, we got to go use Yabasen Shiro and set it up to route through that. And then sometimes going through RetroArch, it's like, oh, this core doesn't work, and you'd have to go and try another core. Emulation is a lot of learning, it is a lot of time, and it is a lot of patience. There are not too many solutions out there that are truly plug and play. And then the ones that have come out that are plug and play, the releases are really slow because a lot of the time with these emulators, you know, if they're not being directly funded, it takes a backseat to life. You know, like, these people have to work, they have jobs and families and kids and other hobbies and just all kinds of stuff that they do. Emulation may be a key hobby for them, but for many of them it's not the focal point of their life. You know, so and a lot of people just kind of go and forget that, I think. They're like, why haven't we had a new release? Sometimes people get busy. I know a lot of emulation slowed down when the pandemic hit, you know? Like, at the end of the day, people are taking their time and their effort to go and make these emulators for everybody to enjoy, and often the emulator is free. We do have paid ones. Some paid ones are really, really good. Other ones, not so much. I try to pay for my emulators whenever I can because I realize we have people working hard on these damn things, and you know, I want to show them that, you know, I care about what they do and I want them to have like long-term viability. PPSSPP is probably one of the more recent examples. Like, yes, it does have a free version. The gold version really doesn't do much, and then like even the free version runs extremely well. It literally runs on anything. And so when you have people that are going and producing quality software like that, you know, they deserve to be rewarded for it. And then, you know, so a lot of people don't really realize this with emulation and stuff. Like, they just kind of want this. I find that the main issue that emulation has these days is, like, everybody wants a seamless experience, but the main issue they run into is they want a seamless experience, and then if the experience isn't seamless, they don't like it, or if their favorite game doesn't run right, they get upset. They don't go, they don't tweak and tune it, like, they don't have that fascination to go and see if they can get it running better. Instead, a lot of the time, I find that a lot of the emulation community is prone to abuse, mainly the people that work on them. They're like, my favorite game doesn't run right, help please, and like, it's good to go and get help. The emulation community is pretty good like that. Like, if you're struggling with something, a lot of the time, people will be on standby. Well, not literal standby, but most people will be around to give you a hand with it. When I was going and learning how to go and run GBA on the Odin, the audio was screwed. Like, completely and utterly screwed. And that stems from the screen's refresh rate. It has a tendency to fluctuate a fair bit. It doesn't sit at a solid 60. It's like it bounces around between 60 and 61. And so a lot of the time with the refresh rate on the GBA going and dictating how the audio would sync, that would create nightmares and like a lot of popping and stuff. And so a lot of the time, you know, like with GBA, I didn't really know anything about it. I know how to do MAME, I know how to do PlayStation and everything else, but GBA was a relatively new thing for me. So I looked at the settings, I said, okay, I don't understand any of this, I'm going to try to get help. And a lot of the people were like, okay, GBA is a pain in the ass to emulate. You're going to have some audio crackle and some audio popping, but we're going to work really hard to try to figure out what's causing it, and we're going to show you the steps that you can take to eliminate it. And so it was actually really nice. It was a learning experience. I mean, I got to the point where, yes, it still pops, but it is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. But a lot of people don't want to take time to be invested in the community to literally go and solve a problem. A lot of people that latch on to emulation and stuff, they want a solution, they want it right there. And a lot of the time, they'll go and they'll harass the people that work on these emulators trying to get a response. And as an end result, what this equates to is a lot of people that work on these emulators, they get sick of it. You have some people that work on emulators that they're fine with asking questions. You know, they're like, oh hey, you know, I'm having an issue with this, what could it be? And a lot of the time they'll be willing to help, but the main issue is not so much that they're asking questions. Like, a lot of people just don't care. If you ask questions, it's when you ask questions when you haven't really bothered to try to go and mess around with it to see if you can get it to work. Like, when I was going and doing my thing with GBA on the Odin, I didn't recognize really any of the settings that I could have tweaked in RetroArch. I didn't understand it. I couldn't really find too much documentation on it, even with a web search and stuff. So at that point, you know, I was like, hey, I should probably go and reach out to the community, and you know, the community is very helpful about it, but a lot of people don't even want to look at the settings. They just want to go and do a post where they're like, this emulator is awful, it doesn't run right, like X game is running at like 15 frames a second, this is fucking dog shit, I can't stand it, yada yada. And so I get kind of annoyed with it because these people work hard on these emulators, and you know, emulators have to have a lot of settings by default because every game runs differently. Like, they automatically assume that every game runs the same pipes and uses the same things and stuff, and they don't. Every game is tailored to the hardware differently, especially on GameCube. You know, so like running GameCube games on the Odin, there's a lot of tweaking and tuning, and then via emulation, some games don't even run at all. I mean, Metroid Prime 1 and 2 do not run correctly. You know, is that the emulator's fault? No, not really. I mean, I'm sure the emulator's going to grow in time, but the thing is really, really amazing show-stopping emulators take time to develop. Because you have to go and you have to incorporate new knowledge into your builds and stuff, and you kind of have to go and build it in a little bit. You know, PPSSPP is an example for this. The emulator's older than the damn hills, so is Dolphin. You know, Dolphin is quite literally one of the best GameCube emulators, and then PPSSPP is the most effective PSP emulator. And the only reason they got there was through constant development, tons of time, tons of effort, working passively in the background. You know, and that's how these emulators got really, really good. You know, PSP was kind of hard to emulate back then. And GameCube is still a pain in the ass to emulate. And, you know, but these people, they go and they work on it really hard. You know, and a lot of people, I think, kind of discount that. Like, they'll go and they'll get started on emulation and they'll be, like, unaware of how much labor goes into these damn things. And so they'll sit there and like, well, this doesn't work, and, you know, that doesn't work, and, like, it's okay to state that something doesn't work. Most of the time when something doesn't work, the developer is already aware of it. Emulators are updated all the time. Well, most of them are updated all the time. I cannot tell you how many times I have opened up RetroArch to have core updates to fix various issues from various cores. And that's okay. You know, I know that PPSSPP is kind of notorious for that. Like, they do have huge releases and stuff a lot of the time, but they also have smaller ones as well. Their huger releases normally fix major problems. For example, I was kind of annoyed. I wasn't so much annoyed at the app, but I was going, and I love Killzone, and I love playing PSP games in general. God of War is my jam. And it was really kind of weird because I downloaded PPSSPP Gold. I didn't know that it was an old version, right? This is why learning is important. I didn't know that it was an old version that was outdated on the App Store. The new version of it just hadn't hit the App Store yet, you know, and so it wasn't fed via update. And so it was kind of weird because I was like, Killzone has always ran pretty badly on PPSSPP, and apparently in one of the bigger updates they had fixed this. And so I had to go and do some reading. It was kind of weird because the App Store hadn't rolled over the new version yet, and, you know, so we do have releases with emulators trying to target certain games. I remember when another large release was trying to fix the various issues with running the God of War games on PSP. And so eventually it hit. Now it runs at 60 frames and it's gorgeous, you know, but there's a lot of patience that's required with emulation. You have to have patience with emulation. Nothing is going to work right out of the box. I mean, NES may, you know, SNES is pretty good like that. And Genesis was pretty open with its Motorola processors and stuff. You know, it was real easy to get up and get running, but as gaming has gone on, consoles have become more complex, and we first saw that with the Sega Saturn using multiple processors and stuff, and, you know, nothing is ever just going to be like, oh, this is amazing right off the bat. You're gonna have to play with it. And so a lot of the time I would go and I'd produce these videos. These SNK titles were no different. To give you an idea, I use, so for all Neo Geo and SNK stuff, I use a core called Final Burn Neo. And then Final Burn Neo takes a little bit of setting up. MAME in general takes a little bit of setting up. Anything arcade does not instantly work right out of the box. You need a lot of BIOS files and a lot of tweaking and a lot of tuning, you know. And so with SNK titles, there was a lot of tweaking and tuning needed, and then some things, if I tweaked and tuned some things, the game wouldn't really run correctly, and I'd have to go back and change it, and this is why I always do test runs before I do filming, to make sure that the emulation is doing really well. So I employ a couple of things, you know, when I go and I play these games and stuff. First one is free play. You know, because I know that me and my godson are going to be dying a lot, so it just really pays to go and have free play on so we can just sit down and enjoy it and keep the game flowing smooth, all the fun stuff. Well, with SNK games on the Final Burn Neo core, if you turn on free play, it automatically loads the dip switch menu, because free play is a dip switch. So some games I would literally have to be like, oh, okay, it automatically triggers this, so I would have to find another way to enable the dip switch and then save it as part of the CFG to get it to function right. That way I could just load up the game, have unlimited continues, and then just go and play it. You know, like, I don't really mind going through and taking time to tweak and tune my favorite games. Out of all the SNK games that I did long plays for, I think like 9 of them required custom tuning. And it doesn't really take that long, you know? Like, it literally takes 5 minutes of your time to literally go and say, hey, oh god, we got Goku over here, Jesus. But it only takes a couple minutes of your time to say, hey, you know, let's tweak it and tune it and stuff. Like, once you get the hang of it, once you become familiar with everything, the process is a lot quicker. You can go and sit there and say, oh, okay, well, I've seen this on other games. I think it may be this. Let's go ahead and try this suggested setting to see if it, you know, works better and stuff. Dolphin is very notorious for that, for a lot of the games that I would go and play on the Dolphin emulator, especially MMJR. And MMJR2. So it's really, it wasn't any different using Final Burn Neo. Now, Final Burn Neo is pretty damn good right out of the box. I didn't really struggle with it as hard as I thought I would. It was pretty much straightforward plug and play and stuff. There was a lot of additional files that I needed. The only file that I did not use was the updated high score file, and that's because I just don't give a shit about it. And so everything else it tweaked and it tuned very easily. There was a lot of things that were left out of the core, like I didn't want to do any sort of overclocking, because I feel that looking at the slowdown for a lot of this is part of the experience. It kind of showcases how old the game is, you know, and various limitations and stuff. And then I found that if I would go and overclock it, it would screw with the recording as well. It would screw with the frame rate a lot. And so after I went and I played with it, I was like, okay, it's going to play well, but it's not going to record well. And so it was a lot of tweaking and tuning before I just kind of said to myself, okay, we just don't need overclocking, you know, but that's a part of emulation, you know, you have to be willing to learn with emulation. You know, you can't really, with emulation, you can't really have the expectation of going and being like, hey, everything should work, because emulation at its core is natively squirrely. Not all settings are going to work for, like, your favorite games and stuff, and the community kind of has your back a little bit, because a lot of the time they'll be like, hey, for this version of this emulator, we have a Google Doc cheat sheet of recommended settings to go and keep the game flowing smooth, essentially. You know, like, we think that these recordings will be the best for you if you use these settings. And so with Metal Slug X, I was kind of victim to this. I would go and I would make recordings and stuff, and I would turn around and they would be very jittery. They would have frame dips, but it wasn't from the game, it was actually from the recording, because Metal Slug X just does not like being recorded. And so I asked about it. I was like, okay, how do we make this happen? I've tried X, Y, and Z. How do we make it happen, Captain? And there would be people that would be like, hey, we think you can do this or do that, or it was actually really, really nice in that regard. So, I mean, don't be afraid of asking questions. Don't be afraid of getting answers. Don't be afraid of learning. Don't be afraid of admitting that you're ignorant. A lot of people go and they want their favorite game to run amazingly, but they don't want to screw off with settings and stuff. And I don't know. It's just really weird, you know, like how the emulation community functions sometimes. So I kind of go back and I look at it and it's like, damn, son. But a lot of the times, if you're willing to admit that you're ignorant, people are willing to say, hey, you can try X, Y, and Z. You're going to want to look at these, and these settings. Like, the weird thing is with emulation, a lot of the issues are looked at as symptoms. It's kind of like the medical field in some regards. It's like, oh, your emulation is running really, really, really slowly. What's your hardware looking like? And if you go and you have good hardware, you know, it's like, okay, well, you can try tweaking X, Y, and Z. You know, and it may give you this effect. And so it's a very interesting thing, I think. So what winds up happening, essentially, is I know a lot of people, like when they try to do a lot of emulation and stuff, they do it on low-end devices, more or less. Like they'll sit there and they'll be like, oh, hey, I want to do emulation on this really old phone, but the thing is for emulation you have to have a little bit of a beefy hardware spec to go and be able to go and bang it out on some things. Like Sega Saturn emulation on phones is fucking difficult. I know that emulating GameCube on the newest phones is a lot easier now, but it wasn't on older phones. I know that I know that emulating PS2 on phones has gotten a lot better. It takes a lot of tweaking and tuning. There's just like a lot of things, you know, and like you have to have adequate hardware to do emulation. Now you can compensate for low-end hardware by lowering the resolution, various tweaks and tunes, cutting some things out. There's all kinds of things that you can do to make it run well, but the thing is if you want to have like a full experience, if you want to be like, okay, I'm running, you know, Metal Slug in like 8K with all these extra shaders and everything else, you're literally going to have to sit there and be like, alright, this is what I need to do, this is the hardware I'm going to need. You know, like, emulation can be very beefy at times. Oh man, I love Sega Saturn. It is one of my favorite Sega consoles, even though it did really badly. And yet, to get it to run correctly, you have to have kind of beefy hardware. For the most part, if your hardware is not quick, the emulation suffers very fast. You know, and with Sega Saturn being one of the harder things to emulate, you kind of just sit there and you're like, oh man, this is tough. You know, like, it's getting better, but at the same time, you need to tweak and tune it to make it happen. Oh man, I fucking hated the trains. Jesus Christ, my phone was so sore after this. I should have turned on the damn dip switch for auto fire. Ah yes, I couldn't turn on the dip switch for auto fire because every time I did, it would go, to tackle this area, it would go and take me to the dip switch menu, and there was no way of getting around it. But no, like I said, I love emulation and stuff, but I think a lot of people have misconceptions. And I wanted to tackle it. I wanted to, like, literally sit there and be like, hey, guys, this is how we do things, you know. Don't be afraid of learning, don't treat the developer like shit, you know, just common sense, kind of ABC sort of stuff. You know, I feel that the expectation for emulation is very unrealistic. At the end of the day, emulation is a lot of time, energy, and raw work. Like, if you want to have a good setup, if you want to be able to play your games flawlessly, you're going to have to commit time to it. And even then, not all of your games are going to run flawlessly. That's not really something that is always able to be achieved. You know, some games are just damn difficult to run, and that's okay. You know, this is why new software is released. This is why we have updates and research and everything else, and you know, it's getting better all the time, but I just kind of wish a lot of people would go and realize this, you know. You're not always going to be able to play your favorite game, you know, and then a lot of people go and, when they go and tweak and tune it, like those that do get the settings, there was one guy, he was going and trying to run PSP on a mid-range phone with 4K resolution and everything else, and, you know, I had to sit down and tell him, like, honey, you can't do that. Oh, well, why not? It's an old game. Yes, the game is incredibly old, but emulation in general can be very resource hungry at times. And a lot of people don't really realize that. Like, they don't really realize that when you go and you're playing old games and stuff, you're not running it often in original resolution. You're, like, either bringing it up to 720p, 1080p, 4K, whatever the hell it is that you want to run it at, and when you go and you start upscaling like that and adding things like bilinear filtering and everything else, and that eats up a lot of hardware specs, mostly, and the train got me. So I think it's just really kind of one of those things where a lot of people don't really realize that you go and you have to be more thoughtful, I think, with it. You have to realize that, yes, these games are old, but it takes a pretty good amount of system spec to emulate it, because you do need a fair bit of power to do so, and then if you want to go and add the bells and the whistles and all the nice things to bring it up to a modern standard, you know, that also takes additional resource. It is kind of cool, though, when you go and you take an old game and you add bilinear filtering and then jack up the resolution and stuff, and everything else, because it kind of feels like you're playing an HD remaster at that point. And I actually really like that. It's one of the things I like about the Out, and I was able to clean up God of War really nicely on it, and I can take it with me now, which is really lovely in that regard. And so I kind of sit back and I look at people and I watch them get frustrated, and it's just like, alright guys, we got to teach you how to do this shit. It's okay, you know, but it's really nice. Like, you can do all kinds of things with emulation. There are some emulators that support translation packs for Japanese games and stuff. Don't speak Japanese? Not a problem. Look up a translated version of the ROM. Sometimes the translations are rough, but they're still nice. I know that for more modern games, we have full-blown texture packs that you can go and download. When I was going and emulating Resident Evil 4 to see how it performed and stuff, there was already a texture pack ready to go. There are some emulators that go and have settings that you can turn on where you automatically download the texture pack. So if you're sitting there saying to yourself, oh my god, these games look old, I cannot look at these blurry textures, oh my god, my virgin eyes, you can have the prospect of going and downloading all new textures for it. You know, there's all kinds of things that you can do with emulation that is just completely and utterly lovely. Now, some things you can't fix. Like, old cutscenes really don't clean up well. When I was going and rocking God of War, you know, I was playing on PPSSPP, the game looks great. The effects look great. Anything that was an active effect looked amazing. Those cutscenes still look like ass. And that's okay. It's an old game. So it was really just one of those things, I think. And so, you know, not everything is going to be able to be fixed via emulation. But with time and energy and effort, you can take all of your old games and you can basically make them look like HD remasters. Like when I was going and doing all these SNK titles, I didn't really enhance them too much. There were some pretty crazy packs out there to bring everything up to like a razor sharp standard. And I didn't really screw around with it too much. I just did freescale a little bit, like BRZ, multipass freescale as I typically do. That was pretty much it for cleaning up the visuals. You know, the games still look amazing all these years later. I also enhanced the quality of the audio as well, because the audio quality by default on a lot of these old SNK games is actually quite bad. It definitely sounds a bit punchy. So I went ahead and I upped that a little bit. Like, there wasn't a lot of tweaking and tuning, it was just mainly getting it up to like a modern standard. So it's like, okay, the audio is a little bit too crunchy, it's a little bit too retro, let's go ahead and clean it up. And then with the texture filtering and everything else, it was like, okay, you know, I don't mind pixels, let's kind of try to smoothen it out a little bit. Like, the enhancement was extremely minimal. So you'll find that as you do, as you like get deeper into emulation and stuff, you'll develop a preference for like almost everything. Like, I use multipass freescale on every game now because it just looks good on everything, and that pretty much takes care of the visuals. Now, on some consoles I do have additional settings. Like for PlayStation, I think it's really weird how every single texture wobbles. It's weird, but it's nostalgic. Like, I understand it's how the hardware was at the time, but the thing that was really kind of goofy about it is I didn't really care how it wobbled around too much, you know, but after a while it would give me a migraine because it was constantly jiggling. And so what I would do is I would go and do geometry correction to make it to where it does not wobble. And then a lot of people like dithering because they're like, oh man, I love that classic aesthetic. And what a lot of people didn't really realize is that dithering was there to do progressive blending to save on a hardware spec. So what would happen is it would leave every other pixel effectively unrendered, and it would rely on the garbage quality of old picture tubes to make up the balance, because picture tubes have a tendency to bleed a little bit. So you could go and leave some pixels unrendered and stuff, and then the TV with, you know, CRTs being CRTs, you know, they could go and just naturally blend it in and stuff. Well, dithering doesn't look good on an LCD panel. I'm sorry, it doesn't. So there's commonly a fix for that as well, especially on Swan Station and Duck Station. Wouldn't really recommend DuckStation too much. The developer's an asshole that has a tendency to fib a lot about a lot of shit. But you can actually go and like clean up the games a bit. But I find with geometry correction as well as the dither fix, it becomes hardware hungry very fast. But not every single console needs that. Like, every console is really unique, I think, with how it chooses to handle things, you know? Like, every console has, like, its little things that you can do with it. I would have to say from NES all the way up to, about Genesis, multipass freescale works amazingly. You know, not a lot of tweaking and tuning needed there. Once I hit PlayStation and Sega Saturn, that's when a lot of custom tuning kind of comes into play. With PlayStation, it's geometry correction, as well as the dither fix to have it function correctly on LCDs without it looking like crap. And then with the Sega Saturn, its big thing, as well as N64, was texture tearing. A lot of the times, given the nature of the emulation, you could literally see in between textures due to how they were laid on the meshes. And then N64 does this as well, so there's a lot of correction that's needed to be employed to have those look at their best as well. But the cool thing is like when you go and you invest in time and you emulate all of this stuff relatively frequently, you eventually remember all the settings you want to use. And so it's kind of like riding a bike in many ways. It's like it looks really scary. When you first start it, you're like, oh man, I'm just starting this, I don't really know what I want to do. But as you continuously invest in emulation and stuff, as you continually play your favorite platforms and play these old games, you just remember what you want to do with it. You're like, right, I'm setting up X, Y, and Z. I want to use geometry correction, multipass freescale, and a couple of other things. And so as time goes on, it becomes easier and easier. And that's really nice. It's really lovely. You know, and like you never really quite forget it. It's kind of like going in and tweaking and tuning your television. Like, have you ever sat there and brought home an old flat screen or something, and you're like, you know, I really want this thing to look at its best for like games and movies. I want the color black to actually look black, and I want white things to look white, but not too white, you know, not like blindingly flashbang white. And so you go and you spend all that time tweaking and tuning your TV, and eventually you commit those settings to memory. Emulation is just like this in this regard, and there's nothing really better than that because it makes setup a lot easier. So an example of this, of putting time and effort into your emulation, is when I got the Odin, it was just a handheld with stock Android running on it with a custom Odin launcher. And so I knew that I wanted a front end on it. I went with Daijisho. It's really good. It doesn't recognize all my games, unfortunately, but for the most part, it's pretty good. There's only one platform that really screws up my games on, that's Dreamcast, but I can go and easily just open up Redream to go and play the games that are missing off the front end there. But the first time I had set up the AYN Odin, I think it took me about 18 hours because I was new to Android emulation. And it was a whole new world. And so I eventually started having issues with my Odin. Well, it wasn't even so much with the Odin, it was with RetroArch, and I figured, you know, I tweaked and tuned so much crap that I'm pretty sure that I broke something somewhere, so I wound up resetting it to factory. Kept all the games on the cart and stuff, because I was using a 512 gig SD card, and I would go back and reset everything up from scratch. And it became easier. You know, I literally, RetroArch was fixed and stuff because RetroArch is relatively unstable on Android at times. And I was able to literally just go and say, oh, okay, well, everything is running great now. And the second time I had set it up, it only took me about 5 hours. But to be fair, I was loading like close to 900 games into it. And, you know, when you're going and tweaking and tuning that much, it's going to take some time and some effort. But as your emulation journey continues, you're going to get better and better at it. You know, like, nobody ever stays ignorant forever. The only platform that I struggle to emulate on the Odin is GameCube. And that's because the Odin, it's like the GameCube I don't even think was really meant to run natively on it. So, like, the Odin literally has a gold core processor, which was on, it was the processor that was featured on older Samsung phones. And so what they decided to do is they took the gold core processor, they went ahead and overclocked it, added active cooling to it, and it ended up in the Odin. The Odin literally has a fan exhaust in the back of it. And so, since it has active cooling, we don't have to worry about things like thermal throttling. And so it's able to go and be a relatively cost-effective processor that is able to be pushed and emulate way more things via active cooling. And so there was like a little bit of tweaking and tuning that was involved with it because of this. Like the fan has various settings and speeds, and you can go and tweak the hardware. Well, it wasn't really initially meant to run like GameCube as well as PS2. The PS2 emulator, Aether SX2, was released during its life cycle. Like, it popped out right as the Odin was getting ready to pop out. And you can play a lot of your PS2 games on it with tweaking and tuning, and then going and getting GameCube running on it was kind of a bonus system because GameCube emulation is a relatively heavy thing. And so these were all like little bonus systems, and given the system spec of the Odin, like how old the chipset is on it compared to like everything else on your phone these days, everything past, I think Dreamcast kind of feels like a bonus system. You know what I mean? So everything up until Dreamcast for the most part runs flawlessly, but for GameCube and PlayStation 2 it required a lot of tweaking and tuning. And that's okay. You know, the setup just gets easier and easier as time goes on. Now, am I going to get all the GameCube games to run correctly? Ha! No, the fuck I am not. I can only do so much with the Odin and the emulators that we have at the time. From what I understand, there's better ones coming, essentially, and stuff, which is great, but you can only do so much with what you have. And so, tweak and tune your games as much as you can. If it doesn't run, it doesn't run. Not every game's going to run. And, you know, just kind of try to be satisfied with it, essentially. You know, not everything's going to be easy. You're going to have to put in time and effort and energy, and you're going to have to learn how to do setups and tweak various settings, and then you're going to have to learn how to use various programs. Like, emulation is very education heavy. You know, so I feel like a lot of people, when they get into emulation, they just don't want it. You know, they're just like, I want it to work, and you know, that's really not what emulation is about. I mean, we do have emulators like it, but at its core, emulation is not about that. You know, we have some people that do commit to things like that. We have other people that don't. It's really just kind of how that is. In many ways, emulation, doing emulation is a lot like learning how to do, what is it? It's a lot like learning how to go and run Linux, because there's not really a whole hell of a lot of hand-holding with Linux, but Linux is a very versatile platform that you can do so much stuff on if you're just willing to learn. I actually really like this boss fight. The overhaul they did to it is actually really, really nice. It was good stuff. Like I said, there really wasn't much to say on this game. I don't think. It was just like, yeah, they did a color palette swap, they went and tweaked and tuned a couple of things, smoothed out the frame rate, and that was it. Let's go! You know, and yeah, such a fun game. I wasn't the best at it, but man, I did have so much fun with it. I really like how a lot of the animations were done in this, how they tried to make them as smooth as possible and stuff. My god. When you're playing an SNK title, you really feel like you're playing a premium product, and I fucking love that shit. It is just so, so good for what it is. The only way this recording was getting better is if I could have stopped dying every 5 seconds. But, you know, for what I'm working with, I'm strangely enough satisfied with it. So, that is going to be the end of the commentary for this game. Not so much a commentary on the game, just on emulation in general. For those that have stopped by, I seriously hope that you enjoyed your stay. If you want to leave a comment, that's fine. Not really worried about views or likes. You know, I hope you guys enjoyed your stay here. If you got any constructive criticism, fuck it, give it to me. And as always, till next time, I hope y'all are doing well. I hope you're being treated well. And I'll see y'all later.
Mission complete! Mission all over!